All right, so let's talk about some cash game hand reading upgrades. I am Coach Brad Wilson and gonna review some of last month's webinar before we dive in. Nobody mind my crazy mouse moving around. That's just who I am, right? So cash game hand reading upgrades. So before we dive into all of the slides, what do you stand to gain? This is an appropriate place to start. Why are you here? What are you going to gain from this webinar? First of all, a higher win rate, right? You're going to win more money by upgrading your language and your ability to hand read and take exploitative actions versus vulnerable ranges. You're going to gain the ability to make more frequent organic exploits and a process for considering post-flop variables and what they mean. And then we're also going to dive into some lessons from MDA, which is mass data analysis. Mass data analysis is basically looking at millions and millions of hands, segmenting that data, looking at how specific villain archetypes react in specific post-flop situations. So it's the difference between what people actually do and what people theoretically ought to be doing, like you learn in PIO. So pretty big distinction there from mass data and theoretical PIO stuff. If y'all don't remember last month's webinar, descriptive post-flop language review, poker language started out by this silly little prospector here that probably had 3 teeth and very dirty human beings spent all their time trying to dig for gold. This is the language that we're working with: bets, calls, and raises. We're improving, we're getting more specific in how we discuss poker strategy, how we describe situations, and then how we think about situations, right? Like if we can think about situations more specifically, then the actions we're incentivized to take become a lot more obvious. And that's going to reduce complexity, which is ultimately, one of the goals. We want to reduce complexity. We want to have simple strategies that are extremely powerful. So tight bets versus loose bets. And I've made little graphs here, not the greatest looking graphs, but this is the range construction of a tight bet versus a loose bet. I'm not going to be covering checks and folds, Matthew, today. Just going to be covering the bets, the calls, the raises. So tight bets versus loose bets. So a tight bet has more value-driven initiative, right? Their hands are stronger on average, and they have less bluff-driven initiative. So they're betting with value way more frequently. And then the loose bet is way more bluff-driven initiative and way more value-driven initiative. Villain makes a loose bet. That means they have more bluff-driven initiative than value-driven initiative, and vice versa. This is just when you're playing a hand and you're describing the type of bet that you are facing from villain, or your perception of the type of bet. Now we have tight call versus loose calls. So you can see on the left, we have a tight call. We have equity realization driven. So open-end straight draws, flush draws, trying to realize some equity. Value driven, you can see large percentage, 32% value in a tight calls range, and then bluff catch driven, 26%, and then float driven call, much smaller. So tight calls have less float driven characteristics. Bluff catch driven calls, attacking are loose, betting are loose initiative, value driven calls, and equity realization calls. And then a loose call here, obviously going to be floating way more often, right? So 40% float driven. They're calling because they think they can bluff us on a future street. The value quadrant goes down, the bluff catching quadrant remains about the same, and then the equity realization goes down as well. So tight call versus loose call construction here in some pie charts. These are just generalized pie charts to give you a visualization of the range composition of a tight call, the range composition of a loose call. Tight raise, loose raise, again, driven by initiative. You can see here that it's the same as the tight bets and the loose bets. They are both initiative. So tight raise, more value driven than bluff driven. Loose raise, more bluff driven than value driven. Pretty intuitive stuff. And now I want to talk about some variables that determine your language, right? These variables are not in any specific order or hierarchy as they are constructed in the slide deck. So the first variable is going to be preflop formation. So how tight is the preflop formation, right? Like typically the looser the preflop formation, the more hand combinations villain has. Post-flop, villain archetypes. So villains, the different type of villains that you face will take different actions. I think this is pretty clear, right? Like a recreational player is going to play different than a reg, and a passive recreational player is going to play different than a volatile recreational player. Bet sizes are a very important variable that determine the language you use to describe the action villain is taking. Board texture, also a very important variable. Villain specific data points. This is historical information that you have. If you're profiling your opponents, this will be hands you've witnessed villain play in a specific way. The reason I use the word formation is this is basically an it's the eagle-eyed view of the situation. So under the gun open is going to be typically a tight formation, right? When you don't have a lot of data points to base what villain's range is going to be, this is like a shortcut. So some villains are going to, they're going to have a looser formation than when they open under the gun than other villains. This is just a generalization of when I open under the gun and UTG +1 or middle position 3-bets us, that's a tight formation. So we're just kind of using these words to describe the makeup of villain's range post-flop. So just kind of a shortcut, right? We just say tight formation instead of, MP 3-betting versus UTG range. So preflop formation, post-flop language describes villain's post-flop frequencies. So when we say that a bet is a tight bet, that does not mean, it isn't necessarily correlated to the overall size of their range, right? So like, even if they get to the flop with a tight formation, they can still be making loose bets, depending on different variables. So tight formation does not automatically mean a tight post-flop range construction. My example here, middle position opens 2.5x, cutoff 3-bets to 7.5x, and middle position calls. So that is a tight formation preflop. Meaning narrow range that 3-bets from the cutoff versus MP, and then MP's continuing range here is going to be fairly tight as well because they're out of position. They're not incentivized to flat a wide range, so this is a tight formation preflop. However, post-flop, the cutoff can still make loose or tight bets on different board textures. So if the flop is, say, King 7 deuce rainbow, we can make an assumption that the cutoff is going to bet their entire range here, which means that it is a loose construction. Whereas on a board like 6, 7, 9, 5, 6, 9, 9, 7, 5, those type of boards are going to be tighter bets when villain opts to continuation bet, because there's less incentive to bet your entire range, less incentive to have a lot of bluff-driven initiative. I do want to talk about this. So potential failure point. Hazy ideas of preflop range construction equals your doom. I know that it sounds very basic to spend time, energy, and effort into understanding preflop ranges, constructing accurate preflop ranges. However, if you haven't spent focused energy on memorizing or understanding preflop grids, you're going to struggle mightily using correct descriptive postflop language. Like if it's hazy, if you don't have anything to base an assumption on, you're just going to struggle with how villain is constructing their range. So one variable to consider, villain archetype. So regs, passive recs, and volatile recs. These are generalized descriptions, obviously, but necessary to talk about. You're going to be describing regs differently than passive recs, and then volatile recs, you're going to be describing them differently as well. And I'm going to get into, kind of a few of the differences between the villain archetypes that you'll be facing. First is the reg, right? We have our little ninja. They're going to be more balanced early in the decision tree. It's likely they've spent energy understanding pre-flop grids. They have a good understanding of 3-bet, balancing their 3-bets with bluffs and value. They're also going to find and execute exploits quickly. So they're going to be able to deviate. They're going to be smart. They're going to think on their feet, and they're just going to, they're going to be trickier to battle against. That's just the nature of playing a person that's thinking at a higher level. They're exploitable in understudied spots deeper in the decision tree. Deeper in the decision tree can be the turn and the river, Matthew, but it can also be, bet 3-betting on flops, right? If that's a scenario that's a scenario I know is understudied as it relates to regs, because people don't bet 3-bet often enough on flops, and so they just haven't taken the time or energy to really dive deeply into what that range really looks like. So sometimes it could be on the turn and river, but then sometimes it could just be, a bet 3-bet on the flop, or, facing a raise on the flop and then leading on the turn when they're out of position. Basically just areas that don't happen at a high frequency, that are somewhat vague. When you're not as studied in those spots, you're not able to navigate them as intuitively as you are when you've studied, you're prepared, when you face the same situation over and over and over and over again. Is bet 3-bet when you bet, get raised, and then re-raised? Correct. Then we have the passive rec here, as described by this little teddy bear. Passive recs tend to be predictable. Their bets tend to be hand incentive driven. So not to say that passive recs don't bluff. Passive recs actually bluff more than you would think they do. They just have too many combinations of hands. They play way too many hands. They have too many loose calls on flops. They make it to rivers where they're unimproved more often, just by the nature of them having more combos that they have to manage. So that just means that when they bet on rivers, like, their incentive is to make us fold, because that's the only way that they could win the hand, right? So they are predictable. They play too many hands, and their bets tend to be hand incentive driven. Calls tend to be loose, right? That goes hand in hand with the hand incentive driven bets. They call too loosely, and then they find themselves with too many weak hands where they have no choice but to start trying to bet and make us fold. Raises tend to be fairly tight. So even though they're likely to bet because they have no hope and they want to win hands, when they raise, their raises tend to be on the tighter side. Volatile recs, they're predictable too in the opposite way, right? We can count on volatile recs to take aggressive actions. If they sense weakness, they're kind of like a shark. They just go nuts, raise too frequently, try to make you fold too often. Their calls tend to be looser because they don't want to give up. They tend to value, it's in their nature to value winning pots above all else. So the way that a volatile rec thinks about poker is that if they win the hand, then that means they're playing winning poker. And if they lost the hand, well, that means they're playing losing poker, right? And that is a very dangerous position to be in, because eventually you're just going to bomb off stacks. You're going to be losing way too much money in pots you have no business in playing. So that is a volatile rec, and they're predictable. They're predictable in that they just take way too many aggressive actions. They're driven by winning the pots. I'm sure most of us know players just like this who just want to win hands. Like, let's just play cards and win hands. And if I fold, well, folding, that means that I lost the hand, and that doesn't feel good, right? Number 3. So variable number 3 is bet sizes. So larger bets tend to be tighter, which forces tighter calls and raises. Smaller bets tend to be looser, which forces looser calls and raises. People are scared to lose a lot when they bluff, right? Like, it's really as simple as that. They're driven by emotion that we're going to get into. But larger bets, as in cash games, a larger C bet tends to be tighter. Smaller C bets tend to be looser. Let's imagine you open pre-flop from the cutoff. You got one caller, a rec out of the blinds, and are now faced with a post-flop decision. So here we have king 7 deuce. Why do you choose to bet smaller with your bluffs on king 7 deuce, right? Risk aversion, pure human emotion. Why risk more when 1/3 gets the job done, right? Why risk more when less gets the job done? This is a very simple thought, but very, very relevant. On the flip side here, greed. When you have a strong hand, you think, why bet less when my opponent's continuing range is inflexible, right? So the two emotions that make this true, larger bets tend to be tighter, smaller bets tend to be looser, risk aversion, and greed. Just pure human emotions, human tendencies. This is backed up by mass data and really just backed up by common sense, right? Like, our intuition can tell us exactly why greed comes into play when we have a hand like ace king, when we have, king 7 of diamonds on king 7 deuce or pocket deuces. Yeah, we want to play a bigger pot, right? We're just greedy. We want to put more money in the middle. And when we have a hand like 8-9 of hearts, yeah, we want to bet 1/3, right? Because we're risk averse. Why risk more when 1/3 gets the job done? Andy says he would always bet 1/3 there. Should I watch for opponents' bet sizes? Absolutely, you should, right? Absolutely, you should. This is a variable that is extremely important. Which archetypes does this matter most against? These two guys, the little teddy bear and this, kind of evil, maniacal bear that's kind of weathered and got a lot of scar tissue. This volatile rec and the passive rec, right? It matters the most against them because they're more likely to be influenced by their human emotions. Andy also asked if he should change his strategy against weaker players, and you absolutely should. Anybody that's not going to notice the difference between 1/3 and 2/3, just exploitatively, that's easy for me to say, huh? Size differently based on the strength of your hand against villains that, aren't going to notice, that are kind of, for lack of a better word, clueless, right? And now we're going to look at some range construction using mass data, right? So this is a rec facing two different size c-bets. And this is across all varieties of board textures. So rec call versus 30% c-bet, rec call versus 70% c-bet. You can see trash right here, 21% trash with the 30%, 8% trash versus the 70%. Matthew asks, what is C3 oak? I actually wondered that myself for a while. That's three of a kind, the old 3 oak down here. So 21% trash, 30% and the 30% c-bet, and then only 8% versus the 70% c-bet, right? They just find it harder to continue facing the large c-bet sizing. Backdoor flushes, gut shots. You can see backdoor flush calls way more frequently versus the smaller sizing. Gut shots, it appears as if Rex, they like their gut shot and they don't care. They're going to call with their gut shot one way or the other. And then the value here, this is going to be pretty similar, right? I would say that like this top pair good kicker here, the differentials between, this 2% is they're just raising this 30% c-bet. They're not calling less frequently, they're just raising with it, right? So here's Rex raises versus 30% c-bet and versus 70% c-bet, right? So they find a lot more trash and a lot more of these backdoor hands, 27, 29% here versus 5, 6, 14% facing the 70% c-bet. So the trash just naturally gets folded more frequently from their range. They don't raise a ton of trash facing the larger c-bet. They raise way more facing the smaller c-bet. Variable number 4, and we're going to get into some more specific mass data on a couple different board textures here in a minute with some charts that show the differences cleanly. So variable number 4 is board texture. So dry boards equals looser bets, looser calls, and looser raises. And looking at mass data once again, you open preflop, passive rec calls out of the big blind, and we get this flop. So a dry flop, king, 7, deuce, rainbow. Looking at the mass data, recreational players on this board fold to c-bets 48% of the time. So they fold quite frequently facing a c-bet. Their calling range versus this c-bet is 19% trash, 13% backdoor flush, 3% gut shots. Open-end straight draw is whenever you search for mass data, it's hard to get the boards exactly like king, 7, deuce. We just do king high and then dry. So likely some like king, 7, 5 type hands got in there, but villains fold to c-bet is super high. They continue with 19% trash. They raise with 17% trash, and then a lot of their raising range is condensed to these top pair weak kickers, top pair good kickers. That's going to be 42% of their raising range here. Looking at mass data on this type of board, that is a very high percentage. They tend to raise their 2 pair on these types of boards, right? 14%, whereas they only call with 2%. So if they flop 2 pair, looks like they're taking a lot more aggressive actions. They're slow playing 3 of a kind at about the same frequency. Then they have all of these types of, less than top pair type hands, ranges that they call with. So 21%, 35% of their hands are just less than top pair type hands. So pocket 8s, pocket 9s, 7x, deuce x, and then the other pocket pairs. Wet boards mean tighter bets, tighter calls, and tighter raises. So ranges are tighter the wetter the board is. NBA example, once again, we open pre-flop, passive rec calls out of the big blind. 7, 8, 9 is our flop. So 7, 8, 9 with a flush draw. We can see here, first of all, the rec folds versus c-bet 31%. So they just continue way more frequently than in the instance of a dry board. Calling range versus c-bet, you can see less trash than before, 15%, backdoor flushes, bunch of gut shots, open-end straight draws, flush draws, combo draws, pair plus draws. They have a lot of hands that they continue with here when they call versus a c-bet. And then when they raise, backdoor flushes, very few, not a lot of trash, not a ton of gut shots, a few open-ended straight draws, pair plus draws. Then down here in the value quadrant, a lot of value. So over pairs, two pairs, three of a kind, straights, top pair, weak kicker, top pair, good kicker. Very condensed on this wet board when they raise versus a c-bet to these type of value hands. And just a little comparison here of the range makeup when an opponent calls. So on the dry board, we can see that looking at the green and yellow quadrants here, 72% of villains' continuing range is in the green and yellow quadrants, which are trash, backdoor flush draws, gut shots, and pairs less than top. That is a massive, massive amount of villains' range that is very weak, right? So this means villains call on a dry board. This is loose, right? When villains range looks like this, that is a loose range. Then we look at the wet board call versus c-bet. We can see just a comparison of the green. So just a comparison of the green quadrants here, less trash and gut shot type hands, less top pairs less than top, and then a bunch of top pair weak kicker, top pair good kicker, two pairs, and sets. So just the more red you see is the more value in villains range, the more red tones. So this red and then orange, and then over here, this red and this orange. Range makeup of villains when they raise on dry boards versus c-bets, and then on wet boards versus c-bets. So again, top pair good kicker when they raise on a dry board versus a c-bet, we have 11% top pair good kicker, and then over here, hands that are better than top pair good kicker that raise. I guess we have 28% here, value quadrant, and then over here we have straights, sets, two pair, over pair, top pair good kicker. That's going to be in the 45%. 45% top pair good kicker plus when villains raise on wet boards, compared to 28%, if my math is correct. 28% on dry boards. So raises on wet boards are tighter, more value heavy than raises on dry boards, which again, makes intuitive sense, right? We can intuitively understand that villains on dry boards, when they raise us, they just have less value in their range. It's harder to have good hands on wet boards, easier to have good hands. Raises on wet boards tend to be tighter in their construction. Now we have some villain specific data points, right? So pay close attention to every hand, even ones you aren't in. Lines and bet sizings used by your opponents are worth their weight in gold. Why are historical villain-specific data points worth their weight in gold? Why are they so valuable? They're tells. They give us indicators as to how tight or how loose villains' ranges are. And then we get to make exploitative decisions against our opponents based on that information. I have a poor soul here that I have found some hands that he played. This is the same exact villain that plays both hands. Now, hand number one, we have, this is the board, this is our hand. So pre-flop, the villain opens small blind, 3x. They bet 50%. C-bet. Turn, they bet 27%. River, they bet 17%. So their hand is jacks. You can see that 50% on the flop, they size down on the turn with their second pair, and then they size even smaller on the river with their second pair, right? Board number two, very similar board, king 6 deuce and then king 5 deuce. This same villain has an ace and 3. Action, a little bit different. They 4.5 button ISO versus a middle position limp. On the flop, they bet 50% with their gut shot. And then on the turn, so the turn is interesting because there's a deviation. 27% with second pair, 50% with a straight. We see a little bit of greed come into play, right? We see a little bit of greed once villain turns the wheel versus when villain has second pair. So sizing indicator here, giving us a clue that this bet is likely looser, this bet is tighter. And then on the river here, 17% with villain's jacks versus 100% when the king pairs when they have a straight. So loose construction here on the river. This is a loose bet. This is a tight bet. This is a hand that wants value, right? So if we can discern that this 17% bet is loose, then we get to call with a bunch of our bluff catchers, right? Knowing that we have a fair amount of showdown equity versus this tight bet on the river. We can fold quite frequently, knowing we don't have a lot of showdown value and that villain is likely just nutted up here when they choose this different sizing. Now, we're gonna play a little game. What do you think villain has? And this is the same villain, right? That we just looked at these two boards, same exact dude, taking what we've learned from just these two little examples of hands that they've played. What do you think villain has? Here's the board, ace deuce 4, here's the action. We have a 3x pre-flop open from middle position, ace deuce 4, 2 diamonds. Our villain bets 50% pot, loose or tight. Likely that loose, more inclined to say loose. And then on the turn, we have a tray and our opponent bets 28% on the turn. So going back to last hand over here, he bet 27% with the jacks. Now he bets 28% here on the turn. Is this loose or tight? Loose, 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 loose. Loose construction here on the turn. They're sizing down. If villain has a straight, they're likely to size up with the pure strength of their hand. Now here on the river, we have 100% river bet when the board puts a wheel. When the river puts a wheel on the board, 100% pot size bet. Is this going to be loose or tight? What do you think matters more? Him having many sixes in his range, or whether or not his bet is tight or loose, whether or not he has value in this specific line that he has used? The range construction is what matters more than anything, right? Like if villain is tight here, doesn't really matter how many 6Xs they have in their range because that's what they're repping. It's easy to add extra complexity to the thought process and be like, well, they don't have many 6Xs, so I should call here. But if villain's betting tight on this river and they have specific betting patterns and tells with the sizings that they choose, that's going to be the more relevant, more important data point. And villain has exactly the 6-8 of different suits. So they somehow manage to raise from middle position with a 6 and an 8 of different suits. Yeah, Chuck says villain may want to avoid a chop. that is possible. However, there's also a lot of incentive from a passive recreational player to check back so that they get their chop, right? So that if they bet, villains can't raise them. There's a natural fear of getting raised on the river when you put more money in the pot. So careful with that, that line of thinking. Recreational players, they're more instinctive. They play with their emotions, so they can show up with some really weird hands that we don't give them credit for in the moment. Maybe they're just bored and wanted to play a hand. Who knows the reasons why, the reasons that drive a person to open with a 6 and an 8 of different suits. So wise words. I want to quote a very wise human, myself. You don't play poker to sound smart. You play poker to win money. So try to avoid complexity in these situations. Don't overthink it. Villain has a strategy construction there where we can discern that flop is loose, turn is loose, and river is tight. And then that's going to tell us what we ought to be doing, right? So use the situational incentives to punish your opponents. So I'm going to go into some heuristics here as to how you ought to be reacting based on the situational incentives, but it's very easy to pass up a plus EV decision waiting for different combination of cards, right? Waiting for the perfect stars to align. And when you're playing cash games, you just want to make the exploits. You want to find as many exploits as you possibly can, and then you want to execute them. That's what's going to get you the money over time. So don't be passing up spots where you think they're plus EV based on some of the variables that we've just talked about, right? Whether it be on like King 7 deuce, villain betting 1/3, and then us finding a wide check raise range so that we're attacking a loose bet. Like if villains don't defend often enough on King 7 deuce and they're c betting range, then we just need to exploit that. We need to drop the hammer down. Where you can kind of go on a slippery slope is by check raising very frequently on those types of boards and then not realizing we're not adjusting that ranges contract once they face our raise and then call. So not served super well by making future bets, but yeah, just use your situational incentives to punish your opponents. Some quick heuristics versus loose bets: attack with loose raises and defend with loose calls. So boards where villain is in your best estimation betting loosely, attack them with loose raises, defend with loose calls. So lots of pairs, some ace highs. Just you have to attack their loose bets with loose raises and loose calls. Tight bets, we're going to defend with equity-driven hands, right? So flush draws, open-end straight draws, some gut shots, if that makes sense. If we have the pot odds, we want to raise with top-end value. So when villain makes a tight bet, whether it be like betting on a wet board or sizing up on a board like King 7 deuce, and we have a hand like deuces or King 7 or pocket 7s, we just need to raise with our top end value. So take advantage of the fact that they're kind of telegraphing that they're making a tight bet and maximize value when you have it, and then realize equity when you have flush draws, open end straight draws. Because the reality is, like if you're drawing to an open end straight draw, you want your opponent to have stronger hands. You want them to be fairly tight so that when you hit, you get paid off, right? So defend versus tight bets with equity-driven hands, and then raise with top-end value. Jeff asks, how do I know how much to infer from betting patterns when there are so few hands you actually see at showdown? It's tough. I mean, you really need to pay attention, right? You just need to see the bet sizings that villains are using. Try to notice deviations or multiple sizings on similar boards. So if villain raises pre-flop and then uses 2 different sizings on tight boards, there's probably a reason, right? So one showdown, like Alan just said, one showdown can tell a surprising amount. He's right. Like just one showdown, you can see or you can construct a fairly accurate strategy of what villain's doing. So the faster you can find these exploits, the faster you can discern between loose and tight bets, the faster that you can exploit these tendencies. Versus loose calls, you know, when you bet and villain is constructing, they have a loose call. So if you remember the green quadrant before, when villain calls with a lot of trash and gut shots and hands like that, just need to be bluffing on future streets, right? Like that's the exploit. We need to over bluff when villains are defending too loosely. So up the aggression on turns versus loose flop calls. And then we can size down exploitatively with value on future streets. This is more applicable to villains that are not paying attention, so the recreational players. And going back to my previous webinars, that's where most of the EV is derived from our strategy from the recreational players. So when villains have loose calls, size down with your value on future streets, right? Like no reason to be ultra greedy when villains are defending with a loose range. You want to maximize your value. Pretty easy, quick heuristic. Versus tight calls, you want to bluff less often, right? Like this is pretty clear. Don't bluff versus tight calls because you don't get to realize as much fold equity. Size up with value on future streets. So when villain makes a tight call and they're likely to continue, size up with your value. So get more money in the pot when villain has a tight calling range and you have value-driven initiative. You've got a hand that beats their value.